Kinji is an ugly, creepy loser who loses his filthy rich lifestyle when he's summoned to another world as a slave worker. However, with the help of a dragon girl who's obsessed with eating his meat, he uses every means necessary to claw his way back to the top. Before this, Kinji gloats about having the perfect life, which he was able to achieve by doing crypto rug pulls and scamming kids like you. As he plans to spend the rest of his life lounging in his underwear, the universe plays a sick joke on him and sucks him into another world with demi-humans called Emiria.
No! No! No!
In this world, dungeons used to be inhabited by monsters and treasures, which the humans cleared for fame and glory. But now, demonite, an ore found in dungeons, is mined as an energy source, giving rise to mining companies like Reizaha that overwork and underpay sweaty, desperate losers, which Kinji has become. As he slaves away, another worker reaches their limit and starts to dance naked, reminding him of his miserable fate. Then his boss appears and queries him for being a terrible worker and dragging the whole group down with him. Later, as he curses his existence, he notices Wannabe getting bullied by a tiny skeleton man and thinks he'd make for the perfect sucker later on. Then he brings out a gold coin to get lunch, but when he drops it under a hole, he discovers something interesting. That night, he approaches Wannabe and takes him out to an expensive lounge, but knowing their pay, he asks how he's able to afford it. And Kinji reveals that he actually owes 20 million gold after striking out on a shaky business deal. After hearing this, Wannabe tries to sneak off, realizing he's a smooth-talking deadbeat, but Kinji tells him he has an opportunity that can change his life. The next day, they get permission from the boss to go deeper into the dungeon and mine more valuable demonite. So they head out, and Kinji shows him a secret passage to the third floor with tons of demonite, assuring him that his holy water sprinkler would help keep the monsters away while they work. So they get to it and end up mining far more demonite than they expected, but on the way out, a pink dragon appears and tries to eat them. While Kinji realizes his holy water expired 3 years ago. Since he's determined to survive, he kicks Wannabe to the curb literally, and the dragon grabs him. But before it can take a bite, he appears and offers a deal for it to spare them, and he'd provide tastier meals than humans in return. Amused by such an odd human, it agrees and transforms into a dragon girl named Rim. Within a month, their profits skyrocket off the charts, but he realizes this was yet another shitty investment, since Rim ended up spending all his money on food. Now that he understands what it's like to be a parent, he goes back to work determined to make even more money, but notices some magical items that Rim had shit out when they weren't looking. When he asks where the actual shit is, she says everything else digests into magical power, and reminds him that she's hungry again. So Wannabe suddenly cuts off his tail and feeds it to her, and he realizes that the staff has the power to control minds. After he recruits the rest of his group and forces them to do all the mining for him as Rim continues to use the staff to brainwash them. But when Wannabe warns him that he can't keep overworking them for his personal gain, he tells them he clearly doesn't know how capitalism works. Later, he relaxes from the day in a bath as Rim joins him in a suspicious position with her mouth below the water, while the rest of the workers complain of feeling unusually exhausted, wondering how the numbers keep going up. The next day, as the workers continue to bust their asses, Wannabe tries to tell him they're all at their limit, while Rim begins to struggle with the staff. As he mouths off about stepping on their miserable, worthless backs to get richer, the staff breaks, and the workers overhear this, so they gather around to put him in a world of pain. After leaving him for dead, Rim tells him she's in the mood again, and when he tells her to read the room, she puts on her demonic face and tries to eat his ass. The next day, he manages to drag himself to work, but sees that everyone's still mad at him. Then he sees the boss telling Wannabe that the upper brass have their eyes on them, as he finds a letter of appointment, transferring them to the Exploration Division group. Later, they get stuck cleaning up mob monsters, and Kinji laments that he hates the stupid company. With how the company works, most of the money is made from their mining and exploration units, which consists of several groups like Group 3, which is in charge of hunting large monsters, and is considered the elite group, and now his group, Group 8, which is in charge of supporting those on the front lines and are considered dropouts. Despite their shitty job description, Kinji encourages Wannabe to get through the day so they can go drinking afterward. So he opens up a chest and suddenly gets wrapped by a perverted tentacle monster that makes him cry out for more while it chokes him. So Kinji dumps a whole bag of supplies on it to save him. Afterward, his superior tells him he'd need to cover Wannabe's shift until he recovers, and that the cost of the supplies he dumped in the chest will be removed from his pay. That night, he walks home feeling like trash, which is exactly what he steals to feed Rem at home. But after gobbling it up, she says she's hungry for a different kind of meat, and jumps onto him to pull out his meat and eat it. Later he goes back to work, and Gandalf gives him a ton of expensive potions to deliver. And when he takes his orders like a mindless drone, he wonders what he's becoming. Inside the cave, he bumps into Kurtz, who's running the other way, and tells him to buy him some time while he escapes from the monsters. But Kenji refuses and reminds him that their lives are the same level of worthlessness. Just then, an army of giant ants catches up to them, and they run for their lives and dive into the water below. When they manage to escape, they rush to the supply shop to try and call for help. But Gandalf assures them that the monsters never come up the levels, just as the man on the phone tells him they can't spare any manpower, but hopes he's finished his work. They turn back to see the ants have reached their level, devouring everyone in their path, so Kurtz tries to keep them out while Kenji searches for something useful in their supplies to save them. Later, the rest of the ants carry on with their jobs while the three of them blend in as ants after taking a transformation potion he mixed with the ants' feet. Then they realize the superiors have sealed off the exits, trapping them inside to be discovered once the drug wears off. So Kenji notices an ant that was left behind from being unable to carry its load, and convinces it that it deserves better treatment from their queen. Not long after, he gathers more and more dissatisfied ants to turn against their queen and fight for equality, with him leading them. Meanwhile, the queen notices the slowed progress with her ants and gets frustrated, since she's finally able to expand her territory with the dragon gone. Then the ants gather in protest, as Kenji shows up in his human form to tell her she's been cancelled. However, she begins to transform into her ultimate form, showing him what it means to be queen, while the ants run away. But just then, Rim busts through the ceiling looking for food, and when she spots the ants, all she sees is her dinner, and she tries to catch them. Immediately, Kenji pulls out his meat to offer her, so she jumps on his face so they can both eat, and all the ants bow to him for saving them, as he gets another crazy idea. Later, he leads Wanabe deeper into the dungeon, as he tells him that the company couldn't care less if they lived or died, which made him realize that they need a leader like himself, and asks Wanabe to join his newest startup, Dungeon Black Company. One day, one of the higher-ups welcomes a woman with impressive cannons to the company and assigns her to some incoming rookies to whip into shape, which she gladly accepts. Meanwhile, Pumba tells the rookies that they're nothing more than scum that he gets to train, and they thank him for the abuse, with even Kenji being compliant, as they're about to head into the dungeons. Once there, he orders the scum to fight a Cerberus, and Kenji laments that his plan to use all the demonite from the ants to get promoted to Group 3, get rich, and live his life in his underwear, is about to end with him being a chew toy. Pumba blows up the Cerberus and moves the training outside, instructing them to run up the mountain in the distance, but when one of the men complains they've been starving since the day before, he drops his meat and tells them they can suck on that if they want. On the way, Kenji begins to lose it and tries to grab a plant to eat, but Wanabe warns him it's actually confusion grass and would fuck up his mind if he eats it. The group faces the rest of the torturous training, and they begin to like it, while Pumba gloats over how much his brainwashing disc is working. As they suffer through more dangerous training with smiles on their faces, Pumba continues to manipulate them with a brainwashing spell, till even Kenji is giving the most kiss-ass speech in the history of corporate work. Eventually, they prepare to set sail, and just before they leave, they sell them some worthless statues, and they all throw their life savings away to buy them. But once they're on board, he snaps out of the trance and punches Wanabe out of his too, grateful that the confusion grass was able to nullify the effects of the brainwashing. As they feel bad for the remaining suckers still under the spell, Kenji says he was able to get revenge after putting confusion grass in the mage's food, turning them violent and blowing up the facility. Once they reach land, they head into the Group 3 office where he sees Kurtz, but he pretends not to know him. So Shia walks up and introduces herself as their superior, and when Wanabe recognizes her, he fangirls over her, but she accidentally knocks him into a coma. After the ambulance carries him off, she offers to show Kenji around and explain how everything works, but when he sees that the company wants to force them to buy equipment from the demonite they dug up, he calls them evil, which angers her, so she carries him off to test his strength. They arrive on level 3 of the dungeon and a monster shows up, which she expects him to fight, but when it tries to attack them, she stops it with her sword and begins to battle it, while he stays out of the way and spots an A. After using her tool to split it in half, she goes to him but notices the ant behind him and tells him to exterminate it. But when he refuses, she suspects he may be a monster too and charges at him. So he calls for Rim, who might be pregnant with his child, but when Shia strikes her on the head with her sword, she transforms into a baddie and gut punches her into the wall. So they tie her up, while she tells him working with monsters is treason. Then Wanabe shows up but is shocked to see her tied up and knows that Kinji is going to drag him into another huge mess. So Kinji takes a picture of her with the monsters and threatens to ruin her reputation if it gets out, giving her no chance but to work for the Dungeon Black Company. On a random night, Kinji walks home lamenting about Rim's endless appetite, when he's suddenly ambushed by the men in black and a blonde lady who tells him he has 1 month to pay up the 5 million gold he owes or exchange his life for it. Meanwhile, Shia replays a memory of her dad walking out on her and swears to never be like him. Later in the dungeon, Shia is excited to carry out her duties, while Kinji is lost in thought over how deep in shit he is with the money he owes. But she insists on teaching them how to explore the dungeons properly and finds some low-level monsters to practice on. After finishing off the monsters, she says they can turn in the parts of their bodies that are concentrated with mana. But when he asks how much they would bring in, she tells him around 1,500 gold for the whole stack. After hearing how f***ed up the rate is, he asks Wanabe how long his tail took to grow, and when he says it grew immediately, this gives him an idea. In a company meeting, Belza informs the group that a death march is imminent, which usually ends up restoring all the monsters and demonites to the dungeon, generating more revenue for them. But when they ask if they're equipped to deal with the Majin that is expected to surface, she says that everything will go according to plan, while Rim watches over a monster in a pit. Meanwhile, Kinji oversees his new monster farm, where they rear the monsters and take the parts they need, giving them time to regenerate them, which is a much better deal than being eaten by Rim instead. Thanks to his idea, he's been able to pay his 5 million gold back, but Shia just can't get behind the idea of making money so easily. Suddenly, the ground begins to rumble, and she falls off a cliff, but he catches her. Back in the company, Belza begins to look for a replacement hero as she reveals that Shia is a sacrifice for the Majin, which usually targets the strongest humans. In the dungeon, Shia defeats a monster, and Kitchen wishes there was a way to travel to the surface instantly, that she brings out a crystal that can do it, but tells him she's saving it for a special occasion. Suddenly, the Majin appears and attacks her, so she blocks its attack with her shield. But when she notices that it's only focused on her, she believes she was brought there to defeat it. However, she's unable to keep up with its strength, so he suggests they use the crystal to escape. But she tells him it can only transport one person and tries to use it on him. He grabs the crystal and throws it at the Majin, transporting it to the surface, and when she asks if he realizes what he just did, he explains that he got it out of the way to buy them more time to prepare, while it makes its way back for her. While the ants prepare, Kijin is told they can't find Rim, but he remains confident and gets comfortable to watch the show. The Majin returns, but falls into a pit below, as the ants fill it with cement, and Shia uses her magic to dry it in place, but it manages to break free. So he switches to plan B and tells Shia she's the next best bet after Rim, but she needs to rest. So he ties her up and uses her as bait, while the ants use a giant rope to make it trip and fall into a flammable goop, which he lights on fire. However, this only causes it to go berserk and release laser attacks, so they escape and Shia tells him that sacrificing herself is the only way, but he tells her that she doesn't have to stick to a rigid way of doing things just because of her father. She asks him how he knows about him, and he says he looked into her and discovered her father was a thrill-seeker who abandoned them, so she admits that's why she's dedicated to her work and doesn't believe anyone should live like her father did. Then he grabs one of her cannons because he can and tells her she's allowed to live however she likes. After, he throws an explosive at the ceiling, which crashes on the creature, giving her time to strike the finishing blow. However, while he rejoices over their victory, it regenerates behind him and tries to take him out. But Rim appears in the nick of time and saves him, while her hair transforms into her dragon form and takes it out. So he thanks her for saving him from such a powerful beast, but she tells him that it was an incomplete version that wasn't born normally because she went outside. But since he doesn't understand a word she's saying, he starts to leave. However, they see a glowing object, and the ground suddenly opens up below them, which he remembers from the time he got Kide. He wakes up in his favorite underwear and rejoices when he realizes that it was all a dream.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
But as he turns on the TV, he sees that his problems have followed him back to his world, and when Rim appears behind him and tries to eat him, he blacks out.
No! No! No!
When he wakes up, he's relieved to find it was just another nightmare. but Ranga walks in calling him the Messiah and asks him to save their world. As he's had it with this isekai bullshit, he starts to ask her questions to figure out where he is, but the airhead consults a book on how to beg in a cute way. So he tells Rim to do her thing so she knows he means business. But when he looks out of the hole, he can't believe he's about to star in The Matrix. Zazel, an ugly geezer, shows up and introduces himself as the leader of their town, and explains that Ranga is their priestess, who is skilled with magic. Then he shows them around and tells them a certain corporation almost destroyed the world by overworking most of the human population, turning them into mindless zombies. As a result, a demon lord appeared and used monsters to rule the world, while the humans escaped underground and have been in hiding for the last 300 years. However, they recently discovered a book of prophecies and a miraculous gate that they used to summon a messiah, which is where he came in. Afterward, he appears before the cheering townspeople, but he says he's filled his quota of useless isekai plot stories and refuses to help. Zazel then pulls out a gun and drops the nice act, but Kinji is unmoved since a gun doesn't compare to the inside of Rim's mouth. As a last resort, Zazel tells him that the prophecy says that the road to Japan would open up once he faces the demon lord, and figures it must be important to him, so Kinji agrees to help. Later, they prepare to set out, and Ranga shows up. But when he looks closely at her, he thinks something might be off other than the switch to her brain. So Zazel tells him she'd be accompanying them, while Ranga begins to rub off fondly against him, but Kinji immediately notices something hard, and after grabbing her nuts, he confirms that she's actually a god. Then Zazel explains that since the prophecy spoke of a priestess, but he was the only child with magical powers, they had to make do with what they had. After hearing this, Kinji wonders if they're even worth saving, but has no choice but to go along with it. So they head outside, and when he sees the ruins, he notices the Rezeta statue and realizes that the world is still Emiria, but in the future. As they ride on, Ranga tells him that the company went to shit after someone named Belzod became the leader, which checks out with him. So they arrive at the Demon Lord's castle, and Ranga uses his magic to blast the entrance, causing a guard dog to ask if the fools know they're attacking General Ant's town, and when he realizes they're in the wrong place, he tells Rim to do the thing but finds that she's disappeared to find some food. After, they get thrown before the menacing General Ant, but he instantly recognizes Kinji and tells him he's the same Ant A from the dungeon all those years ago. This surprises him, and he asks if he's on steroids, but he says he simply grew and moved up the ranks. Then they catch up over lunch, and he informs them that most of the other ants went back underground after he left, but those who stayed received the blessing of the Demon Lord. Ranga's glad to see that he's well connected, but when Kinji asks if he should be calm about them fraternizing with the enemy, he says he doesn't really give a shit about anything but going outside. So Ant A begins to rant about the issues he's facing at work, just as a human barges in and destroys the table and gearing Rim. But after Kinji calms her down with his meat, the man explains that the humans are sick of working 8 hours a day, with 2 days off, which surprises him. Then Ant A explains that the humans are f***ing lazy, so he doesn't know what to do, and can't consult the Demon Lord cause he never appears in public. So Kinji tells him to leave the rest of him, and he sets up punishments for humans who disobey and rewards for humans who perform best, making the workplace a toxic corporate masterpiece. Later, he returns to the human town and f***s them over, choosing to work under the Demon Lord as a general and take over their town. Later, Ranga takes a steamy hot bath while Kinji and Rim join in since they lack boundaries, but when he sees how large Kinji's sausage is, he remembers why he sticks to dressing up as a girl. As Kinji plans to continue rising in the Demon Lord's ranks so he can finally have an audience with him, a hidden camera records him and transmits his plans to 3 desperate perverts who enjoy the view. So Dawn, Ash, and Holler plan to deal with Kinji to protect their status in the Demon Lord's army. The next day, the group heads out on a suspicious-sounding order to hunt deserter monsters, while Ash watches from afar as her trap unfolds and giant desert worms emerge to block their path. But when Rim defeats one with a single blow, the remaining worms decide to join him as his underlings, getting him promoted again. As the other 2 idiot demons watch Ash's miserable failure, John decides to show them how it's done and sends them in order to cultivate plants in a barren wasteland. However, with the help of the sandworm and Ranga's magic, they're able to pull it off easily, so Holler decides to run a background check on Kinji. But when he finds absolutely nothing on him, he switches his focus to Ranga and discovers a secret to use against her. Later, he approaches her at the bath and when he says he knows the secret from her past, Reinga asks what he wants from her, and though he really wants her to try the Gok 3000 on him, he tells her to stand up and apologize to the camera. When she does, Haller is shocked to see she has a sausage, which surprisingly makes him even happier. But before things go any further, Rim appears and knocks him into the sky. Later, they lament their failures when Kinji suddenly picks up the camera and thanks them for being stupid enough to help him secure his place with the Demon Lord. This angers them, and they decide to use their ultimate weapon on him. Later, Reinga wakes up in an Alice in Wonderland fever dream and sees a floating Kinji bunny, who tells him they have to see the queen, but on the way, he meets some cute little bunnies that work endlessly for the queen, and when they see him they turn into giant demon rabbits, demanding for paid time off. He manages to escape into a hole, but ends up in a place that drains your will to live, an internet cafe, and quickly starts to waste away in front of the screen. So Kinji tells him that he has to choose between working to death like the rabbits or wasting away with no purpose at the cafe, but he realizes that both options are hell. Suddenly, the others begin to run, saying the queen has arrived, and when he goes to find out who the queen is, he sees it is Belza, who is his ancestor. Belza reminds him of how much he suffered just for being related to her, and tells him to spend the rest of his life with her instead, but when he refuses, he ends up in a dream cell and desperately tries to wake himself up. But when he starts to lose hope, the real Kinji appears and headbutts him back into reality, where he remembers they got an order to fight a giant robot that shot a strange beam at him, causing him to black out. Kinji announces that his rise to a board member is finally complete, so they finally get to meet the Demon Lord face to face, and when they enter the throne room, they discover it's yet another baddie who wants him to save their world. So she congratulates them for making it to her castle, but as she walks toward them, she trips and her head comes off, leaving them horrified. So Kinji suggests they pretend they were never there. But when she reattaches her head, they ask what the fuck she is, and why she looks just like Rim. Then she explains that they're technically sisters, but when Rim has no idea what she means, she transforms into a familiar, terrifying form, and he recognizes her as the Majin from the past, so Rim changes to her baddie form to stop her. She then explains that they are actually guardians of the dungeons and by extension, the planet, and that a race called Colonians, who created magic power, were the ones responsible for executing him both times. She continues and says that they're responsible for managing the circulation of magical power and protecting the dungeon's treasures from humans. But since Rim was a starving idiot, she abandoned the dungeon, which cut off the magical power and caused her to be born as a replacement. However, Kinji cuts to the chase and asks her if she can get him back to Japan, and she tells him she can, but before they get to that, she snaps her fingers and reveals Reizaha forces swarming outside, explaining that they managed to get their hands on Colonian tech and used up too much magical power, which forced her to go to the surface and send them into a rift between dimensions. However, as they're almost able to break free, their goal to turn all the humans into literal mindless machines like the one they defeated is dangerously approaching, unless Kinji goes back in time to stop the current future. So she presents him with two doors, one to Japan and one to Amoria's past, and he surprisingly chooses Amoria and returns to the past to find Shia and Wanabe. Then they head to the surface, and everyone is excited to see he's still alive after disappearing for a month. He gets summoned by Belza, who tells him he owes 10 million gold for an extended period away without work, damaged goods, and the search party that looked for him. And the blonde lady appears and tells him his debts have also increased, but he confidently tells them he'd pay it all back in no time and walks away. Afterward, he shows up at Shia's place to crash, since he has nowhere else to stay, and she has no choice but to house all the homeless losers. But when she notices Reinga, she asks who exactly he is, which prompts Kinji to tell her the wild story about the future, but she finds it hard to believe. Then she gets a phone call reminding her that there's a corporate party that night with free food and booze. So they gladly attend the party, and everyone gets shit-faced while Reinga talks to the director and kisses his ass for a job. Meanwhile, Kinji runs into Kurtz, who tells him that no one expected a worthless, power-hungry man like him to make it back alive, but was relieved to see that he did. Then Shia calls his attention to the endless amount of food that Rim's been eating and informs him that the company won't pay since she's not an employee. So he decides to drink his sorrows away and orders all the booze he can get. The next day, as Kinji hurls his guts out, Reinga announces that he's got an interview for a job and decides to take Rim along for a fun day out, even buying her a fur coat. That night he returns and says he's being paid to look cute and respond to customers, while Rim returns with another pregnancy, And when Kinji asks what trash she ate up this time, Wanabe tells him she broke into the dorms and ate all their food, which will be subtracted from his pay. Since he's sick of all the piling debts, he reveals his plan to get to the Colonian tech before Belza and take over the world instead. But Wanabe interrupts his delusion and tells him the third floor and beyond are much tougher than they used to be. So they gather around as he explains how the new plan will pay back his loans, but the rest of the group agrees that his debt isn't their problem. Then Shia shows him the evaluation sheets from headquarters that show the average worker is on level 20, while he's only on a level 5. With this, she plans to train him to be stronger using her hot teacher outfit, so he goes through another round of hellish training with Wanabe, only to remain as useless as he was initially. And when she explains that everyone else can convert mana into magical power to boost their physical strength, he realizes he's essentially the weakest man in their world. After he drowns his sorrows at a bar, he regrets not going back to Japan and returning to his life of riches, as he curses the god of this world for his fate. But when he's done with his midlife crisis, he thinks of a way to return to his lazy lifestyle. Back at the apartment, Ranga and Rim have playtime with the gun from the future, which annoys him, so he grabs it to keep it away. But when Rim tries to take a bite out of it, it begins to glow and announces that it's fully operational after absorbing mana, and its purpose is to eliminate its user's enemies. Later, they return to the dungeons, and using the company's reports, they see that Belza's men are on the 5th floor, so they need to catch up and surpass them. Suddenly, 2 dungeon wolves approach them, but Kinji tells them to lead them to him, and uses the gun to send a powerful blast that eliminates them instantly, which surprises Kurtz and the rest of his team, who secretly watch from above. However, when he tries to use the gun again, it announces its insufficient energy reserves and activates its emergency protocol, and they can tell something's about to go horribly wrong. Immediately, it begins to suck up all the demonite they had collected to restore its energy, and even begins sucking out their clothes, leaving all their plots exposed, which angers Shia, since she has the biggest ones. The group ties him up and roasts him for being such a f***up, but when he tells the gun that he'll sell it off the first chance he gets, it begins to count down to self-destruct and take him with it, so he takes it back and promises to find a way to use it. As they head deeper into the dungeon, they reach an abandoned site that used to be full of adventurers, so one of Kurtz's men tells them the story of a hero who tried to rescue his lover from a dragon, but was stabbed in the back by his mage, who imprisoned him in the dungeon, causing him to become a ghost that now haunts the area. Suddenly, a bunch of zombies come through the wall and attack, and after figuring out they're the missing adventurers, they fend them off, but one of the men gets bitten, turning him into a zombie, as they retreat into the walls. After wondering what in the hell just happened, they notice Kinji's also missing but left his underwear behind. Then Rim picks up his scent and leads them through a false wall, down a staircase, to find the corporate zombies making illegal potions. They spot writing on the wall that is responsible for the curse on the workers, so they pretend to be part of them, to get closer to the writing. However, they all suck at their jobs, and their cover gets blown when she refuses to pee in a bottle. So the zombies attack, but they manage to fight them off long enough for Ranga to destroy the writing on the wall, which lifts the curse on the workers. However, when they still don't find Kinji, Rim leads them deeper inside, as the girls bond over their shared attachment to him, even though he's nuts. However, they find him with his tool dangling outside his shorts, while the ghost is on its knees getting wet. When they ask what the f*** they're witnessing, he tells them he was abducted by the mage from the story. Then the ghost interrupts and explains what actually happened. Hundreds of years ago, she was partnered with a selfish, greedy hero who let her do all the work, while he made off with a hot chick. So he tried to seal in the dungeon as punishment, but he broke free and labeled her a traitor, causing her to be sentenced to the dungeon to die from overworking. After sensing Kinji's presence, it reminded her of the jacket that left her there to rot, so she kidnapped him to brainwash him with her own hands. But Kinji says even he is not weak enough to be controlled by such a pitiful loser. So the ghost flies up and reveals her new plan to go to the surface and force everyone to be corporate drones. But when Kinji breaks the news that everyone's already working till they drop, the ghost decides she has no more regrets and can leave in peace. Afterward, they visit Cindy's shop, and Kinji complains about the defective clothing that he got from her, demanding she give him for free, so Shia swoops in and apologizes that he's being such a Karen. But he reminds her they're flat out broke, and tries to convince Cindy to come to an understanding with him. However, when she says that her father left her the shop, and she hopes to one day buy it back from Reza, he says he's willing to help fill her shop with customers in exchange for the best gear in the shop. So they shake on it, and when he asks what her unique selling point is, she shows him the potions that the mage Ghost made, which the Reza forced her to buy, so he comes up with an idea. Later, Kurtz and Rim help two adventurers in the dungeon and show them that they're able to do this thanks to Dead Cow, a special combat potion. After sharing the message of Dead Cow and even broadcasting it on TV, the store gets packed with customers. So Cindy asks how he was able to pull it off, but he simply says he made it a little addictive. However, the men in black show up and tell them they're banned from selling anymore, making Kinji realize the confusion grass was overkill. But before they can take him away, he leaves Cindy in charge and makes a break for it. Afterward, they finally arrive at the 4th floor and find it looks nothing like the rest of the dungeon. Later, they defeat a bunch of dinosaurs, and a maintenance team for the 5th floor thanks them for their help, explaining that they're all trapped on the 4th floor, while the rest of their team, Belz's bodyguards, are trapped on the 5th floor with 2 large monsters in front of a gate. So they take them to their base, but on the way, they notice the monsters attacking each other and wonder what's going on. Then a strange lady shows up carrying a child and tells Kinji she's missed him. Confident in his pull-out game, he denies having anything to do with a kid, but she reveals that she's the dungeon ant queen. When they discuss later, he recognizes the kid as the Majin, and the ant queen tells him that all the problems in the dungeon are connected to her illness. Rin looks sad and leaves the room, and she later returns with monster meat for the Majin to eat, but she rejects the food and starts to act out, while the ant queen tries to calm her down. Kinji watches Rim fail at trying to help her sister, so he approaches her late that night, and she tells him she feels bad for causing everyone so much trouble and asks him to help save her. The next day, he gathers everyone and tells them the plan to manually rebuild the dungeon and correct its magical flow, so they get to work with redistributing the power to the monsters evenly. While Rim still struggles to handle her sister, as she suddenly comes down with a fever. She gets some ice to cool her down, but her hot head melts it instantly, causing Rim to travel to Icelands to cut out more ice, while Kinji and the rest continue to rearrange the dungeon's ecosystem. After using up all the ice, Rim offers her some food to eat, and she finally eats it, just as the rest of the group wraps up with their final job to defeat a giant spider. When he returns, Rim tells her she's finally healthy, so they suggest Rim gives her a name, and after remembering what impressed her the most outside, she names her Sky. So Sky finally starts speaking and plans to go on an eating spree with Rim, but suddenly feels a sharp pain in her body, just as the men on the 5th floor see that the boss monsters have mysteriously increased. So the men run for their lives, while Alice tells them to stay and fight for Belza. But when he's about to become monster food, Kinji swoops in and saves him, while the ants carry the rest of the men to safety. Alice then tries to command him to work for Belza, but Kinji slaps the little out of him, reminding him he's a loser, but commends his resolve to push forward. Afterward, the troops band together to defeat the monsters, and when Alice asks why he's helping them, he says they're doing it to help a friend, which impresses Alice as he begins to admire how popular he is with everyone. Just before their final attack, Kinji approaches Alice again and begins to raise him up, while the group wonders if he plays to the other team. So they coordinate their attacks, and Rim delivers the final blow, which finally causes the monsters to disintegrate, and when Kinji tells him he couldn't do it without him, Alice starts to feel something rising. Then an ant tells them Sky's condition has stabilized and that they've found the door to the 6th floor, so they follow it and get to a room with a glowing door. He tells them it might be dangerous and volunteers to make sure it's safe, so everyone cheers him on, and Shia cries from how far he's come as he ascends the staircase. However, he touches the artifact and tells them it was his plan all along to steal the power for himself, and as he glows with blue energy, he thanks them for being stupid enough to believe him. Then he summons giant monsters to the surface, and just as Belza receives the news, Kinji arrives, hands in his resignation, and repays his debts, but she promises to make him regret stealing her power. 3 months later, he enjoys the success of his new dungeon-themed park, explaining his plan to regenerate other dried-up dungeons too. But when Reinhardt asks why he chose to turn it into a theme park, he explains that Belza's mistake was digging up the demonite till it ran out. But thanks to a dungeon manual he got his hands on, he discovered that the dungeons actually draw power from humans, giving him an endless supply of demonite. Meanwhile, Belza discusses the loss in profits with her board members, hoping this won't lead to a crash in the demonite market, when Kinji crashes the meeting and asks them to join him. However, she assures him her company would crush him since he's just one man. But a few days later, she sees that the demonite market has indeed crashed thanks to him. Next, he runs her supply stores out of business by using monsters to deliver goods from Cindy's booming company. So Belza tells her assistant to cut down on quality, since that's probably how he's making so many sales. However, Wanaba heads a lab in charge of quality control, now glad he chose to leave Reza and do meaningful work, but they're sad that she had chose to stay with Belza's company. Later, she drowns her sorrows at a bar, as she cusses out Kinji, but when she leaves, Rango approaches her and says she should consider changing her ways and stop exploiting people, which angers her, causing her to pick up Shia's company worksheet and get a devious idea. Some days later, Kinji gets arrested while Belza holds a press conference stating bullshit allegations of him using illegal means to rise to the top, while Shia sits by her side, remembering how she convinced her to lock him up, claiming she'd be saving innocent lives. Wanaba and Ranga step outside and wonder what they can do to save him, while the Queen Ant arrives and tells them she's found it. Meanwhile, Kinji gets interrogated by Suri, who tries to get him to confess by any means necessary, but he continues to hold out. After, Shia visits him in his cell, and when she sees he's badly wounded, she heals him and apologizes for the part she played, but he tells her he hasn't been defeated as long as his will remains intact. Meanwhile, Belza continues to plot to take over after stealing the power from Kinji, just as Wanaba and the rest of the group gather around to discuss the emergency manual Kinji left behind. A month later, Reza's shareholder meeting takes place, and she gets promoted to director of the company. But before she can celebrate her win, a new motion is moved to make Kinji the CEO, and when she demands to know how the that happened, Wanaba and the rest stand up and explain that they bought and schemed their way into the company. But when she insists that they can't have a criminal for a CEO, Kinji walks in with Suri and Shia, who have proof of his innocence, and with the majority of the votes, he becomes CEO and helps the Reza company to grow massively. After finally achieving his goals, he ditches his underwear completely and pees on top of the Reza building. But when he falls into his pee, he realizes something is missing. Later, Wanaba notices that he's beginning to act strangely and proposes to the others that he might be planning to head back to Japan. So they throw him a farewell party, which makes him glad, as he can drink all the booze he wants. Then he tells them of his plans to expand the business to the rest of the world. This shocks them, and they ask him if he's sure he doesn't want to return, but he says he's worked too hard to leave, so they all return to normal, as Rim continues to rack up the dinner bill, making him lose his mind. Finally, he returns to his original workset, where he first dropped that gold coin, and when he picks it up, he announces his ambition to rule the world. Will Kinji spread his crazy ideas to the rest of the world? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video.